The house in the woods. I was tired of city life. The hustle and bustle, the fast pace, the crowded streets and cars, it all made me feel suffocated. I longed for somewhere quiet, a place where I could truly relax without being bothered. One day, while surfing the web, I came across an ad for a small, isolated house in the countryside. The owner promised that there were no neighbors for miles. The photos showed an old, one-story house surrounded by dense trees and a large lawn. It was exactly what I was looking for. Without hesitation, I booked the house for a week, quickly loaded my things into the car, and drove away without telling anyone where I was going. The trip took a little over 3 hours, and by the time I arrived, the sun was already setting in the west. The driveway to the house was just a small dirt road, lined on both sides with dense bushes. My wheels rolled over the gravel, making a long, rustling sound. As the house came into view, I slowly stopped the car and looked around. The house looked older than the pictures online. The roof was sagging in places, the paint on the outside was faded, and the window frames were covered in dirt. I opened the car door, stepped out, and took a deep breath. The air carried the damp scent of earth and pine. A gentle wind blew through the trees, making rustling sounds. No one was around. Not a soul. I stepped onto the porch, noticing a thin layer of leaves covering the wooden floor. The front door creaked slightly when I opened it. Inside, the small house was neat but simple. A small living room connected to the kitchen, a bedroom in the back, and a small bathroom next to it. The only furniture was a wooden table, 2 chairs, a couch, and an old single bed. There was no TV, just a radio on the shelf, but it was broken. I didn't mind. I just wanted a week of peace. The first night passed relatively peacefully. I made a simple dinner, sat reading by the dim yellow light until my eyes grew heavy. Everything was quiet, so quiet that it made me a little nervous. The only noise I heard was my own breathing and, occasionally, the creaking of the ceiling wood. I also heard a small rattling sound inside the wall. Probably mice. Nothing to worry about. At midnight, I locked the door, turned off the lights, and went to bed. I woke up at dawn. Not to the alarm clock, but to a strange sound. Footsteps. They echoed outside my bedroom window. Slowly. Cautiously. I held my breath, trying to listen better. The footsteps continued, then, stopped right outside the window. I was so nervous that I could hear my heart pounding. A chill ran down my spine. After a few minutes of silence, I mustered up the courage to walk to the window. I gently pulled back the curtains and shined my flashlight on the ground below. No one was there. I looked around, but saw no trace other than my own old footprints from yesterday. There was no sign that anyone or animal had just passed through here. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. The next day, I decided to explore around the house. I walked around to the back, where I found an old well, covered with a rotten board. A little further away, there was a small shed, which looked like it was about to collapse. A rusty padlock hung from the door. Curious, I looked inside through a small opening. The darkness inside didn't let me see much, but there was something, a strange feeling that made me not want to stand there any longer. I turned back to the house, trying to push the thoughts of this morning out of my mind. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. That night, I lit candles instead of turning on the lights, since the power in the house seemed unstable. As I sat reading, I heard another sound, a loud thump in the hallway. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly walked down the hallway. Sweat began to form on my palms. I swept the light across the floor. Nothing. I opened the bathroom door. It was empty. I opened the bedroom door. Everything was the same. I went back to the living room, trying to convince myself that it was just the sound of wood creaking. Then came another sound. This time, it came from the kitchen. A heavy thump. I rushed to the kitchen, turned on every light I could. Nothing. The stove was still off, the cupboards were still closed, the back door was still locked. But I knew what I had heard. That night, I was awakened again. But this time it was not footsteps. It was a whisper. It rang right next to my ear, even though there was absolutely no one else in the room. Not words. Just a small, continuous sound, like an ancient mantra. My throat was dry. I felt sweat trickle down my forehead. I tried to hold my breath. Then, from the darkness, the bedroom door opened slightly. A shadow passed by. I wanted to scream. But my throat was tight. Outside, a strong wind suddenly blew through the uneasy sensation. The air in the room was thick, as if under an invisible pressure. I turned on my flashlight, scanning the area. The furniture was intact, nothing had moved. But then, a small sound, the sound of dripping water from the hallway. I turned my head, the flashlight's beam hitting a faint shape. It slid across the wall, flickering like a shadow that didn't belong there. I stumbled back, almost dropping the flashlight. When I regained my composure and shone the light in that direction, the shape was gone. A rush of adrenaline shot through me, making my legs tremble. I walked toward where it had appeared. There was only a faint stain on the wood. I touched it. It was cold. I pulled my hand back. I tried to convince myself that it was just a stress-induced hallucination. But the creepy feeling wouldn't go away. I checked the windows and doors, all were locked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I couldn't sleep. My body tensed, listening for the slightest sound. In the middle of the night, a scratching sound came from the window. Soft at first, then fierce, like claws on wood. I jumped up, ran to the window, and threw it open. Outside, there was only darkness and the muddy ground after the rain. No one was there. My breathing became rapid. I quickly slammed the window shut. I tried to lie down, but the feeling of unease wouldn't let me go. I listened to the rain pattering on the roof, but mixed in with it was another sound, a distant whisper. I held my breath, straining my ears, but it quickly died away. The noise continued from the hallway. I picked up my flashlight and stepped outside. Muddy footprints appeared on the floor, leading from the living room to the back door. They looked like human footprints, but they were misshapen, as if there were too many toes. I touched the nearest one, the mud was still fresh. My heart was pounding. The back door was ajar. I was sure I'd locked it. I slammed it shut, but my anxiety was growing. I backed away, clutching the flashlight as my only weapon. If anyone was here, they hadn't left yet, I thought. I decided to leave the house. As I gathered my things, a sound came from the living room, something being dragged across the floor. I froze, but I didn't check. I zipped up my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and rushed to the front door. My hands were shaking so much that it took me a moment to open it. I didn't know if I was being followed, but the feeling of dread was nagging at me. When the door swung open, I rushed out as if escaping a nightmare. Outside, the cool morning air gave me a small relief. I quickly stuffed my bag into the car and turned to lock the door. That's when I saw. In the living room window, a dark figure stood there. Tall. Twisted. A chill ran down my spine. I blinked, and it was gone. I locked the door, ran to the car, and started it. As the tires crunched over gravel, I found myself breathing again. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I kept expecting to see a figure standing on the porch. But nothing. Back at the apartment, I locked the door, pulled the curtains, and sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling. It felt like something had followed me home. I didn't tell anyone the whole story. Maybe telling it would bring it back. I lay awake that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard small rattling noises somewhere in the apartment. Maybe it was just a plumbing fixture. Maybe it was the neighbors. But I couldn't be sure. I had escaped that house. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The scenery outside was reflected in the glass window. I saw my own pale image, my eyes dark from sleepless nights. Around 2 a.m., I heard light footsteps again, this time in the living room. A shiver ran down my spine, and I tiptoed down the hallway. The space was pitch black. As I got closer, a chill ran through me as I caught a glimpse of a figure standing by the couch. I took a sharp breath, my mind blank. I immediately turned on the light switch, but the figure was gone. All that remained was my own rapid breathing and pounding heartbeat. I stood still for a long time, not daring to move. The next morning, exhausted and anxious, I decided to ask the landlord about the history of the apartment. In the cramped office on the ground floor, he listened without showing any emotion. I asked if anyone had ever complained about strange phenomena, but he just shrugged, answering perfunctorily, "People come and go." His seemingly unwillingness to delve into the subject made me even more uneasy. At the office, I couldn't concentrate. Every loud sound startled me. My boss asked if I was okay, but I just said I was sleep-deprived. On the way home, the sky was gray, predicting more storms to come. When I got home, I threw my coat on the chair and headed straight for the window. The wind whistled through the cracks, and I immediately pulled the curtains shut, hoping that would hide the creepy presence. Around 9 p.m., the sound returned. Footsteps echoed from the kitchen to the living room. I sat on the bed, clutching the phone, contemplating whether to call the police. But what would I say? There was no intruder, just strange noises and a fleeting figure. Lightning split the sky, light flashed behind the curtains, thunder shook the walls. I clutched my flashlight, walking slowly toward the living room. My socks slid lightly on the hardwood floor, each step heavier. When I got to the window, I stopped. A dark figure stood just behind the curtains. My hands shook, the flashlight wavered as it touched the fabric. A soft sigh sounded, or was it just my imagination? Gathering my courage, I yanked the curtains open, shining the light outside. Nothing. But the air seemed heavier. Then a new sound appeared, a light tapping on the glass. My heart sank. I moved closer, pressing my hand to the cold window. Wiping away a patch of steam, I looked out. The dark rooftops across the street were hidden by the lightning. No one was there. But then, the shadow appeared, faint, shifting as if it were inside the glass. Fear welled up in me, and I backed away, stumbling into a chair. The figure disappeared. I spent the next hour turning the lights on and off, checking every corner of the apartment, but found nothing unusual. Stepping out into the hallway, I quietly watched the neighbors' doors, wondering if they had heard anything. But it was too late to knock, and I didn't want to appear panicked. I placed a chair near the window, flashlight in hand, and waited. Rain pounded against the glass, the wind howled. Every now and then, I sensed a shadow, but whenever I looked closely, there was nothing there. By 3 a.m., the storm had dissipated. I fell asleep, physically and mentally exhausted. The next morning, I woke up with a fear I couldn't name. Life here. I wasn't sure how much longer I could endure. Footsteps in the night. Late at night. The room was dim, save for a faint yellow glow from the streetlights filtering through the curtains. I sat on the bed, my legs drawn up, my back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know what it was, or why it was here. But one thing was certain, I no longer felt safe. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I expected to see movement. A shadow. A vague shape. But nothing. Just heavy silence, just the thick darkness of my small apartment. I clenched my phone in my hand. Maybe I could call my landlord tomorrow morning. Maybe I could find another apartment next week. But right now, all I could do was sit here, waiting for dawn. I didn't think I could sleep tonight. And I wouldn't open that window again. I arrived in this city late in the afternoon. The sun was slowly setting behind the old roofs, covering the streets in a pale yellow. This was an ancient city, famous for its winding alleys and quiet corners, where whispers echoed in the dark. I had heard rumors about this place. Stories of shapeless ghosts, invisible footsteps following lone travelers. I used to laugh at such urban legends. I had traveled to many places, heard countless myths, most of them exaggerated or simply jokes. And yet, as I stepped off the bus, a strange feeling crept across my skin. Like an invisible cold wind. The air smelled of time. Tall, gray buildings stood still like ancient ghosts. The streets were deserted, only a few pedestrians passed me silently, their faces hidden behind scarves or the shadow of their hats. I had a reservation at a small hotel, but I wanted to walk around first. I wanted to see for myself the rumors. My footsteps echoed on the uneven cobblestone sidewalk. The old streetlights flickered, casting faint circles of light on the ground. I heard my own footsteps echoing, but something was wrong. Every time I stopped, the sound continued. I turned around, but there was only an empty street behind me. The windows of the houses were covered with thick curtains or tightly closed shutters. There was no one. It was just my imagination. I kept walking, but the feeling of being watched did not go away. A small convenience store was nestled on the side of the deserted street. The neon sign flickered faintly, its blue-white light illuminating the dim street. I pushed the door open and entered. A small bell rang. Inside, there was the smell of old wooden shelves, of overripe fruit. A man stood behind the counter, his eyes glued to the small TV in the corner. I walked up to the counter, feeling the comforting warmth of the light. I've heard rumors about this place, whispers and shadows. The man looked up, looking at me with lazy eyes. Nonsense. People here like to scare strangers. But then his voice dropped a little. Still, it's better to be careful at night. I frowned. What do you mean? He didn't answer, just shook his head and leaned over the counter. I didn't ask any more. I bought a bottle of water, then turned back outside. Night had fallen, and the air had suddenly become heavier. The air was thick, making it hard to breathe. I quickened my pace, hoping to get back to the hotel soon. Footsteps echoed on the sidewalk. This time, I was sure they weren't mine. I glanced at my phone, it was almost midnight. I turned onto a side street where the light was dimmer. My heart pounded as I heard a light tapping behind me. Like claws on concrete. I stopped, turned around. Nothing. Just darkness. I clenched my phone, forcing myself to keep going. I came to an intersection with no streetlights. The buildings on either side were boarded up, the bricks covered in dust and black residue. I turned on my phone's flashlight, shining the light forward. On the opposite wall, there was a strange symbol. A circle with lines crisscrossing it. It wasn't new, the lines were faded, as if it had been there for decades. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Then I heard it. A light scratching sound. Right behind me. I turned, my heart pounding. I raised my flashlight and shone it behind me. No one. But this time, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I could feel it. Something was standing in the darkness, just a few feet away from me. The air was thick. I couldn't move. But I knew I couldn't stay here. I swallowed, gripped my phone, and walked. My footsteps echoed on the wet pavement, matching the pounding in my chest. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking forward. The darkness behind me was getting thicker. But I didn't stop. There was only a short distance to the hotel. I had to get out of here. I had to. The mysterious bell. I came to this city with the desire to start a new life. New job, new environment, I needed a place to settle down. When I saw a small apartment in an old building, cheap and close to work, I immediately agreed to rent it without hesitation. After signing the contract on a Monday afternoon, I stood outside the building, looking up. The peeling paint, high windows and dust evoked an indescribable feeling. The landlord said the place had been empty for years, but I didn't care. I just wanted a place to live. The first night. When I entered the apartment, I immediately realized that there was something wrong with the atmosphere. There was a musty smell in the air. The apartment was larger than I expected but old, covered in dust. A lone couch sat in the corner, next to a floor lamp tilted to one side. On the wall of the hallway, I noticed an old beige rotary phone. The wire was twisted, the plastic near the earpiece worn. I was curious and tried dialing. To my surprise, I heard a signal sound. I picked it up and listened. The sound was clear, nothing unusual. I put the phone down, shrugged, assuming that the line was still working somehow. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The air was heavy around me, as if something invisible was watching. Sometimes, I heard noises from the hallway, like someone walking in the dark. Every time I turned on the flashlight to check, the hallway was completely empty. The next evening, when I got home after a long day, the apartment was unusually quiet. I turned on the air conditioner, took off my coat, and ring, ring, ring. The rotary phone rang. I was stunned. No one knew I lived here. I didn't even know the number. I hesitated for a few seconds and picked up. Hello. No answer. Just a small sound, like static, then maybe a soft breath. Who is it? I asked, feeling a chill down my spine. No answer. Just a click, the call was disconnected. I put the phone down, feeling uneasy but trying to reassure myself that it was probably a wrong call. The next day, at noon, the phone rang again. I picked it up and heard the same sound as before, static, a soft breath, then disconnection. This time, I didn't take it as a coincidence. I began to feel that something was wrong. That evening, I went to see Mr. Davidson, the building manager. Is the apartment I rented before occupied? Oh, it's been empty for at least 5 or 6 years, maybe longer. Why? Has anyone ever wired a phone? He shook his head, looking at me strangely. No one lives there, so who uses the phone? His answer sent shivers down my spine. If no one had wired it, why would the phone still work? The tension escalated. That night, the phone rang twice. Both times I picked it up, only to hear faint breathing before the call was cut off. I began to panic. I went through every corner of the apartment, opened every closet door. There was nothing but dust and eerie silence. I pulled the phone cord from the hook, thinking that would stop it. But an hour later, it rang again, even though the cord had been unplugged. I froze. This couldn't be happening. I pulled up a chair, sat in front of the phone, and waited. But that night, it didn't ring again. The next morning, I decided to try calling a number from the old phone. I dialed the number of a nearby coffee shop, but instead of hearing a ring, I heard a familiar sound, a faint breathing sound right next to my ear. I hung up, my hands shaking. Who had I called? Or was it me who was being called? As I was about to rush out of the apartment, a thought flashed through my mind. I turned back, staring at the dial phone. I picked it up again. This time, there was a whisper on the other end. A hoarse, distorted voice said, "Don't stay there." I threw the receiver down hard, and rushed out of the apartment without looking back. As I ran down the stairs, I heard the phone ringing behind me, the sound seemed to echo throughout the empty building. The screen faded to black. The ringing echoed in the darkness. I moved into this apartment 3 months ago, not a fancy place but within my budget. At first, everything seemed normal, until the calls started. There was no pattern: morning, noon, afternoon, evening, even midnight. Every time I picked up, I heard heavy breathing on the other end, then the signal was cut off. No words, no identification. I thought it was a mistake, but the calls kept coming, and coming more and more each day. I told Mr. Davidson, the building manager, about this. He just shrugged and said it was fine. To prove it, he called my landline from his cell phone, and it worked. "See," he said, as if I was imagining things. But I knew the calls were real. I started unplugging the phone at night to avoid being disturbed, but during the day I kept it plugged in, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. I called the phone company, and they said there were no problems with the line. I began to suspect that the previous tenant, Jay, might have left the number with someone else. But that didn't explain why the calls were just breathing. One night, around midnight, the phone rang. I hesitated for a moment, then picked it up. "Hello?" No one answered. Just breathing, slow, labored. I tried to stay calm. Talk or don't call. On the other end of the line, a faint mumble sounded, as if someone was trying to say something but couldn't make it out. Then there was a loud static noise, and then the signal went dead. I put the phone down, my heart pounding. There was something about the sound that made me shiver, like someone was calling my name. In the days that followed, I didn't dare plug in the phone. I wrapped the cord around it, put it in the closet, and closed the door. I told myself it was over. But every time I walked past the closet, I felt like it was still waiting, ready to ring at any moment. I continued to live in that apartment, but I no longer felt safe. I began to hear little noises at night, a rattle on the walls, distant footsteps in the hallway, even when no one was there. I always felt like someone was watching me. But there was nothing I could do but wait. And then, one night, as I was drifting off to sleep, a familiar sound rang out. The phone rang. But I had unplugged it. The phone was still in the closet. I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding. The ringing continued, long and persistent. I couldn't ignore it. Finally, I stood up and walked to the closet. My hands shook as I opened the door. The phone lay there, the cord still wrapped tightly. But it kept ringing. I picked it up and held it to my ear. Nothing but breathing, closer, clearer than ever. And this time, I heard a voice. Whispering, but desperate. "I'm right here." The lifestyle. I'm not the type to panic. I've lived alone for years, in a small apartment on the top floor of an old apartment building. The building wasn't the best in town, but it wasn't dangerous either. I'd always felt safe, until that night. I got home later than usual. The hallway light was flickering strangely, but I didn't pay much attention. When I opened the door to my apartment, I knew right away that something was wrong. Clothes and papers were strewn across the floor. But the scariest thing was that there was no sign of forced entry. The front door was closed, with no sign of forced entry. I never locked it, a bad habit I now regretted. The building manager heard me calling and came to check. He leaned out the window, shining a flashlight along the ledge. There was only dust and darkness. No one was there. I felt a chill run down my spine. If no one had broken in through the front door, could someone have come in through the window? But my apartment was on the top floor, there was no way anyone could have climbed in. We searched everywhere. Nothing was missing. My laptop was still there, my passport, watch, and important documents were intact. There was just one strange thing: someone had been rummaging through my belongings. Shirts and pants were pulled out of the closet, receipts and old papers were scattered about. It wasn't like everything had been randomly tossed around, it was like someone was looking for something. But looking for what? The manager suggested I check the security cameras. We only had one camera at the main entrance. But with its poor quality, the chances of seeing the intruder were slim. He left to check the other floors, and I locked the door carefully for the first time in months. I checked my phone. No new messages. No missed calls. I thought about calling the police, but then stopped. What would I tell them? That someone had come into my apartment, rummaged through my stuff, but taken nothing? My hands were still shaking as I checked the apartment again. Nothing was missing, but an uneasy feeling still clung to me. I sat down in a chair, trying to calm myself. But then I glanced at the window. A possibility ran down my spine: if the intruder hadn't left through the front door, he might still be in the building. I clenched my fists, staring at the door as if it might swing open at any moment. I didn't dare leave the apartment. What if I went out and ran into him? About an hour later, the manager returned. He said there had been no signs of forced entry on any other floors, and the security cameras hadn't picked up anything suspicious. You should lock your door at all times, he advised. And call the police tomorrow morning. I nodded, but I didn't feel any relief. The manager seemed concerned, but not entirely surprised, as if he had seen too many strange things in the building. A sleepless night. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound in the building startled me. Footsteps on the stairs, a door opening and closing somewhere, the rustle of a water pipe, everything suddenly seemed suspicious. I checked the window 3 times, making sure it was locked. I even pulled a chair up to block the door, a temporary defense. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I finally got some sleep near dawn, but then I was woken up by a knock on the door. It was the police. They came to take my statement. But they found no evidence of a break-in. No one else in the building had reported anything missing. There was no sign of forced entry. It could have been some homeless person who got into the wrong room, one of the officers said. You should be more careful anyway. They left without a clue. The old and secret house behind. I tried to go about my life as normal, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't go away. I locked my doors at night, checked my windows, kept my phone within reach. But every time I thought about the mysterious intruder, I shuddered. A few months later, I received word that I had inherited a house from an uncle I had never met. I hadn't planned on spending the summer in a rundown old house, but I had no choice. When I arrived, I immediately sensed something was wrong. From the outside, the house looked sturdy. But inside, there was a strange atmosphere, the smell of old wood, narrow hallways, and small rooms that felt strangely cramped. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The layout of the walls didn't make sense. Some hallways were too short. A closet jutted out at an odd angle, like there was a space behind it. And when I pushed it open, I saw a door. An old door, covered in dust. With a broken lock. Just like the door to my house the night the mysterious intruder appeared. I held my breath, feeling a chill run down my spine. I didn't know who had entered my apartment that night. The mystery behind the walls. I had never believed in ghost stories or strange mysteries. I always thought that everything had a logical explanation, until I discovered a hidden room behind the walls of my new house. I had not moved here long ago. The house was in a quiet rural area, far from the city, the only place I could find an affordable home. From the outside, it was nothing special, an old 2-story house with peeling paint and loose wooden shutters that rattled in the wind. I liked the quietness of it, liked the feeling of being alone. But from the first night, I knew something was wrong. When I went to bed, a strange smell hit me, cigarette smoke, very strong. But I lived alone, and I had never smoked. I checked every corner, but found nothing. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a lingering smell from the previous owner. But the unsettling feeling didn't go away. One morning, I decided to explore further. I took a flashlight and looked in every corner of the house, especially in the closet in the master bedroom, where I had noticed something a little strange. Scratches. On the wall behind the closet, there were deep, long scratches, as if someone had scratched it with a fingernail or something sharp. I ran my fingers over the surface, and it felt rough. My heart pounded. That wasn't normal. I continued to check around and found something else, black burn marks on the corner of the wall, as if someone had pressed a hot object against it. When I touched it, it felt like burnt wood. Along with that, the smell of cigarette smoke seemed to be thicker. Has someone been here before? I began to feel uneasy. It felt like I was trespassing somewhere that didn't belong. But I couldn't stop. I examined the floor, and found a slight unevenness. In the far corner of the small room, when I pressed my heel down, the floor sank about half an inch, then stopped. A trap? A secret cellar? I took out my pry bar, trying to pry up the board. It just bent, made a cracking sound, but didn't spring. I tried again, harder, but still. Nothing changed. A feeling of anxiety began to spread through me. If this was a secret passage, who had used it? And could they still be here? I decided to leave the room. I walked quickly out onto the porch, took deep breaths of fresh air, and tried to calm myself. From the outside, the house looked completely normal. No one passing by would think there was a secret inside. What should I do? Ignore it? Seal it and never come back? Or should I find out? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining someone sitting in the dark, inside the hidden room, smoking and leaving scratches on the wall for reasons I couldn't understand. I kept hoping to hear some noise, some sign that I wasn't alone. But there was only silence. And that silence was more terrifying than any noise. I decided not to give up. I would search the house records at the town hall, see if there were any plans or notes about modifications, secret rooms. Maybe I would find out who had built this fake wall and why. But that would take time. And while I waited for answers, I had to live here, in a house where I wasn't sure if I was really alone. Every morning, I check my closet, making sure nothing has changed. I keep the door closed at night. I sleep with a flashlight on my nightstand. But I can't deny one thing, every time I think about that room, my chest feels tight. Something is wrong here. And I have a hunch, this story isn't over yet. The mirror in the attic. I had been haunted by my family's attic since I was a child. No one in the family talked about it, and everyone brushed it off when I asked why we never went up there. It's just a storage place, they said. But I couldn't help but wonder. The attic door was always slightly open, as if inviting me. There was no lock, no chain. Just an old wooden door, its hinges rusted, sitting silently on the ceiling like a blind eye silently watching. One autumn afternoon, as yellow light filtered through the windows, I decided not to hesitate. I pulled out the old wooden ladder and climbed. Each step creaked under my weight. When my hand touched the handle, it felt colder than I had expected. The door opened with a long groan. Inside was darkness. The air smelled of mold, of old paper, of rotting cloth. I turned on my flashlight. The dim light caught the layers of dust floating in the air. Chests lined the walls, covered in a thick layer of dust. Some were locked, some were open, revealing tattered pieces of clothing, old books. But then I heard a sound. Chanting. It wasn't clear, just a low, distant hum, as if coming from another room, a room that didn't exist here. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkest corner of the attic. A large mirror leaned against the wall. The old wooden frame was engraved with strange symbols, the swirling lines seemed to move in the dim light. The glass was covered in dust, but I could still make out my reflection. I moved closer, my heart pounding. As I reached up to brush the dust off the frame, the chanting suddenly grew louder. Not a single sound anymore, but a chorus of whispering voices. Cold. I felt a wind blow against my back, though no windows were open. I bent down, peering closely at the mirror frame. The symbols carved into it were unlike anything I had ever seen. Could they be letters? Symbols? I didn't know. But I knew one thing, they weren't static. They flickered, as if something were breathing inside them. I heard the sound of wood scraping against the floor. I froze. The sound wasn't coming from me. I turned my head, but saw nothing. But when I looked into the mirror, I saw something behind me. The darkness in the mirror was thicker than the loft I was standing in. It was like another space, a distorted room. And there, a figure stood silently. I turned around. There was no one. But when I looked back into the mirror, the shadow was getting closer. I wanted to run. But my legs were frozen. The chanting was now hissing, pressing down on my mind. I had a feeling that if I stood there any longer, I would never leave this loft again. I yanked off the nearby sheet and threw it at the mirror. For a moment, the chanting stopped. The air returned to silence. I staggered back, my heart still pounding. I didn't dare look in the mirror anymore. I turned and ran down the stairs, slamming the door behind me. I never went back to the loft again. But I knew one thing. The mirror was still there. And it was still waiting. Chanting in the mirror. I had never believed in the paranormal. But that changed the night I stepped out of the mirror. It all started when I moved into my family's old house. The two-story house had belonged to my great-grandfather, a man no one in my family ever mentioned much. The attic had long been abandoned and used. But one night, I heard a sound coming from above, a steady, distant chanting, as if coming from somewhere else. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to investigate. When I pushed open the attic door, the sound was still there, but no one was there. There were only dusty old chests and a large mirror leaning against the wall. The carvings on the frame bothered me. They looked like ancient characters, but there was something off, like they were moving when I wasn't looking directly at them. I moved closer, looked into the mirror. And I saw myself, but not me. My reflection seemed distorted. My eyes in the mirror were darker, deeper. And I realized it wasn't moving like me. As soon as I realized it, the reflection's lips moved slowly, making whispers, the same chanting sounds I'd heard. I jumped back, my heart pounding. As I turned and walked out of the loft, still staring at the mirror, I had the feeling that someone was watching me. After that night, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of something watching me grew stronger. I decided to forget about the loft for now, but something else caught my attention, an old diary. I don't remember opening it, but the next morning, it was open on my desk. On the page, in pale red ink, was a scrawled line. 7:15 a.m., brushed teeth. I shivered. That was exactly the time I brushed my teeth this morning. But I had never written it down. I checked every window, every lock on the front door, every corner of the house. No one was there. But as I continued to flip through the diary, the notes became more ominous. 9:03 a.m., drank coffee. 12:47 p.m., checked phone 3 times. 2:15 p.m., felt someone was staring. The last line broke out in a cold sweat. Because right then, I had felt eyes on me. I put the diary down, trying to calm myself. But then, on the third night, a new note appeared. Tonight, 3 a.m., opened attic door. I swallowed. I didn't write that. And I didn't mean to. But I was wrong. I tried to ignore the words. I told myself I would sleep well and forget about it all. But at exactly 3 a.m., I woke up. Not from a nightmare. Not from the alarm. But from the open door of the attic. I don't remember getting out of bed. I don't remember going up the stairs. But there I was, right at the threshold of the attic, my hand touching the doorknob as if I had opened it myself. Inside, the mirror was still in the same place. But this time, the image in the mirror didn't reflect the attic. It reflected somewhere else. A cold room, with walls covered in carved characters, white cloths hanging loosely as if they were hiding something. And in the middle of the room, there was a person standing there. No, not a person. It was me. I stood in the mirror, staring at myself with a blank gaze. My lips in the mirror parted slightly, emitting a steady chanting sound. The loft darkened. I couldn't move. My reflection raised its hand, but I didn't move. A crooked smile stretched across the other face, and then I saw it speak. It's time. The room spun. An invisible force pulled me toward the mirror. I struggled, but my legs lost all feeling. For a split second, I saw my image reach out of the mirror, to replace me. I don't remember what happened after that. When I woke up, I was in my bedroom. But things were not the same anymore. The next morning, I checked the diary. A new line had appeared, the handwriting no longer scribbled but neat and clear. Don't check the mirror. But I couldn't resist. I walked to the bathroom, looked in the mirror. It was still me. But something was wrong. I lifted my hand, slowly, to check. The image in the mirror did the same thing, but there was just one problem. I didn't lift my hand first. The image in the mirror did it before I did. I wasn't me anymore. And someone, or something, had taken my place. My apartment was small but tidy. I had lived here for 3 years without any strange occurrences. But one evening, as I sat working, I heard a slight noise. A click. I turned around, the cupboard door was slightly open. A wooden box lay on the floor, its lock still intact. I frowned. The box should have been on the shelf, locked. I put it back. But the next moment, I felt something was wrong. I looked again, the box was sitting on the shelf, as if it had never been moved. My back went cold. But that was only the beginning. The next day, I found an old leather-bound notebook on my desk. I didn't remember ever owning it. When I opened it, I saw that the pages were filled, in red ink. What was even more terrifying was the content inside. 8:15 a.m., he woke up, his eyes still tired. 8:20 a.m., made coffee, but forgot to add sugar. 9:45 a.m., he felt like someone was watching him. My hair stood on end. It recorded every single thing I did, every single thought that crossed my mind. I tried tearing out a page. But when I opened the notebook again, the page was still there, as if it had never been touched. I shoved it into a drawer and locked it. But the next morning, it appeared on my bed, wide open, writing on. This time, it not only wrote about what I did, but also recorded thoughts I had never said. He is reading this with horror. He is thinking about burning it. But if he does, he will regret it. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding. Since I got the diary, my apartment has been anything but normal. At night, I hear footsteps in the hallway. When I turn off the lights, I can see shadows gathering in the corners of the room. They have no clear shape, just dark patches that seem to move, as if they are watching me. Once, when I passed the mirror, I saw a blurry figure standing behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. I tried writing in the diary. Who are you? After a few seconds, new words appeared, not in my handwriting. I'm always here. I threw the notebook to the ground, breathing heavily. I wanted to throw it away. But when I picked it up, the next page had words written on it. Don't do it. I panicked. I threw it into the fire, but it didn't burn. The pages just turned black strangely, as if burned into another dimension, but still intact. A final line appeared, sharper, darker. I warned you. From then on, I no longer felt safe in my own apartment. Every night, I heard the sound of pages turning. No matter where I locked the diary, it was always there next to me when I woke up. The shadows grew more and more visible. I could feel their cold breath on my back as I slept. I knew I was no longer in control of my life. But maybe I never really had control in the first place. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. It felt like something was in the apartment, even though I knew for sure that no one was there. Strange noises echoed in my mind, like bare feet running over metal beams. I tried to breathe deeply, telling myself it was just my imagination, but when I picked up the phone to check the walls, I swore I heard the noise. During the day, everything seemed normal. The office was bright, people were busy working, the sound of phones ringing and keyboards tapping drowned out all other sounds. I tried to bury myself in my work to forget the strangeness of the night, but the tension still smoldered inside me. Things changed when it got dark. The office was quiet, the space felt large and empty, the air felt stale. Every time I heard a rattling sound on the ceiling, my heart pounded. I checked around constantly, peering into vents and dark corners, worried that I would see that hand again. One day, I decided to share my concerns with Alan, a coworker. I mentioned vaguely that someone might have snuck into the building through the old maintenance shafts. Alan just laughed and said that it wouldn't be surprising if someone lived in the abandoned basement. His words did not ease my mind, but only made me more worried. I called the building management office to report the strange sounds after hours. A maintenance man was sent to investigate. He tapped on the wall, shined a light into a few vents, and said he found nothing. Maybe rats or pigeons came in through the roof, he said. Then he set a few mousetraps in the closet and called it a day. There was no more thorough inspection. That night, I stayed late to finish some unfinished tasks. Around 9 p.m., the power suddenly flickered. The lights dimmed and then came back on. The air became heavy. I heard a slight rattling on the ceiling, the sound moving from one side of the room to the other as if someone was crawling on it. I stood up, my heart pounding, trying to locate the source of the sound. Suddenly, a ceiling panel in the far corner caved in, as if someone had pressed hard on it. I quickly picked up my phone, turned on the flashlight, and shined it on that corner. As soon as the light hit, the ceiling panel returned to its original position, but dust from the ceiling slowly fell. I didn't say a word, just slowly backed out of the office. As soon as I reached the hallway, I heard a scratching sound on the wall, this time right behind me, very close to the door I had just come out of. I ran to the elevator, cursing under my breath. My heart was beating so fast that I felt a sharp pain in my chest. When I got out on the street, breathing in the cold air, I gradually calmed down. The security guard gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. From that day on, I never stayed in the office after 7 p.m. again. But work didn't always go my way. One Friday night, I was forced to stay behind to finish an important financial report. The feeling of anxiety lingered all evening. I tried to play soft music to drown out any small noises. But around 11 p.m., I took off my headphones to make a phone call, and right then, I heard a light scratching sound behind the nearest partition wall. Feeling a chill down my spine, I turned on the flashlight on my phone and approached the wall. As I tapped lightly with my knuckles, the scratching suddenly became more frantic, as if something was reacting to me. I pulled my hand back, my eyes darting around the ceiling, the corners, the vents. I didn't want to see that hand again. I didn't want to see a face appear in the cracks. Suddenly, there was a thud, as if something heavy had fallen on a beam inside the wall. I jumped back, my breath coming in short gasps. My phone buzzed, making me panic even more. It was a text from the building system, alerting me to an overnight HVAC inspection. I tried to steady my breathing, but the scratching continued, this time moving. It slid along the wall, as if dragging its fingernails along with me. I couldn't ignore it. I followed it down the hallway, terrified but determined not to let it disappear without a trace. As I approached the corner office, where I'd seen the hand, I noticed the crack in the wall was still there, small but noticeable. I raised my flashlight, shining it into the crack. The darkness inside seemed to shift. I held my breath. A faint breath, or maybe a low hiss, came from within. And then I saw it. The ghost in the mirror. The clock ticked toward 1 a.m. The highway stretched on forever, plunged into darkness. There were no other cars, no streetlights, only faint reflectors on the pavement that flickered in the headlights. I had been driving for hours, trying to get through this remote area before I was exhausted. The radio in the car was just a static noise, mixed with the voice of some presenter. But I no longer paid attention to it. What caught my attention was the reflection in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just a play of light. A blur, perhaps a tired illusion. But then I realized it was becoming clearer. For the first time, I saw the outline of a face. Then thin lips, slightly parted. But what sent a chill down my spine were the eyes, or rather, the deep, dark holes, as empty as an endless void. I suddenly pressed down on the accelerator. The speed increased rapidly, the engine roaring like a scream in the dark night. My entire body tensed. My shoulders ached from holding the steering wheel so tightly for so long. I glanced at the mirror again. The figure was closer. A heavy feeling filled the air in the car. Then I felt a warm breath on the back of my neck. The air conditioner was turned forward. There was no reason for there to be warmth behind me. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was about to jump out of my chest. I dared to speak, my voice trembling. "Who's there? I know you're there." There was no answer. There was only the static of the radio and a strange sound, like someone was whispering through the static. I felt the presence behind me growing stronger. I didn't dare turn around. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw the figure moving. It wasn't sitting still in the passenger seat. It was inching closer to me. I gripped the steering wheel, staring straight at the road. But when I glanced sideways, its face was close to the seat next to me. It wasn't quite there. It was flickering between existence and nothingness. But I could see its pale lips moving, as if it was trying to say something. I was startled and swerved the wheel. The car lurched across the road, tires screeching. I struggled to keep my balance, my heart pounding. I shouted, "Leave me alone." There was no response. But the figure was still there. I looked frantically outside, hoping to find a glimmer of hope. And then, I saw it. A green sign appeared on the side of the road. Next town, 30 miles. 30 miles. Not far. If I could just drive another 30 miles, I would be somewhere with people, with lights. I told myself I just had to focus on that number. 30 miles. But then, I felt something touch my right shoulder. As light as a thin piece of cloth brushing against my skin. I panicked, jerking the wheel again. The car swerved, the wheels scraping the pavement, my heart pounding. This time, I couldn't take it anymore. I pressed down on the gas, the speedometer shot up. The wind howled outside. The figure was still there, in the rearview mirror. It didn't disappear. Then I saw the light. A small gas station appeared ahead, neon lights illuminating the night sky. A pickup truck was parked at one of the pumps. I drove down the ramp, slamming on the brakes in front of the convenience store. My whole body was shaking as I turned off the engine. I looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing. Maybe it was afraid of the light. Taking a deep breath, I unbuckled my seatbelt and opened the door. Cold air rushed in, giving me some relief. I looked through the car window, the passenger seat was still empty. No ghosts. I grabbed my wallet and walked into the store. The clerk, a young man, looked up at me and nodded. I nodded back, trying to act normal. But my hands were still shaking. I stuffed them into my pocket to hide them. "Can I use the restroom?" I asked. The clerk handed me a key attached to a plastic card. The bathroom was at the back of the building. I stepped through the store's light, into the darkness. The bathroom door was under a flickering light. I unlocked it, stepped inside, and locked the door behind me. The air smelled of disinfectant. The light was dim, but at least I could see myself in the mirror. I stared at my reflection. My eyes were wide, filled with fear. I turned on the faucet, splashing cold water on my face. Each drop woke me from my panic. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath. Then I opened them. And I saw it. Behind me, in the mirror. A pale face. Lips moving. And empty eyes. The whisperer in the woods. I never thought that a simple night hike could turn into a nightmare. I liked the quiet, the sound of my footsteps blending with the natural sounds of the forest. That's why I chose an old, remote trail, a place where few people set foot. I drove to the entrance of the trail, parked in a clearing where only darkness fell between the dense rows of pine trees. As I entered the forest, the flashlight in my hand illuminated the path littered with dry leaves and tree roots. A gentle wind blew through the branches, carrying the smell of damp earth. I felt calm, even happy. But that feeling didn't last long. After about half an hour of walking, fog began to appear. At first it was just a thin mist, but then it thickened, swallowing the light of my flashlight. I felt like I was entering another world, where everything became hazy, distorted. I tried to ignore the unease and kept walking. Then I heard it. A soft whisper, like a breeze, came from up ahead. I stopped, straining my ears. There was nothing but the rustling of leaves. I shone my flashlight around, seeing only twisted trees and thick darkness. I told myself it was just the wind, but as I walked, the whispering came again. I tried to ignore it, but then I began to notice fleeting movements in my peripheral vision. Tiny shadows moved between the trees. Every time I turned around, they disappeared. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was the fog, or the flashlight shining through the branches. But the deeper I went, the more distinct the shadows became. Suddenly, a branch snapped to my right. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand. There was nothing but fog and overlapping tree trunks. But there was something strange. I felt something move, but I couldn't see it. This time, I was really scared. I checked my phone, no signal. I started to think about turning back, but when I looked around, I wasn't sure I was going in the right direction anymore. Everything looked the same, the trees, the fog, the darkness. And then I heard it. My name. Someone, or something, whispered my name right behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam flaring wildly. There was no one there. But I could feel a presence. My throat tightened, my heart pounding wildly. I shouted, "Who's there?" but only the wind whistling through the trees answered me. I started walking faster, almost running. I didn't care about finding a way anymore, I just wanted to get out of this place. But the forest didn't seem to want to let me go. The shadows became more frequent. They weren't just standing still, they were moving, gliding past me, lurking behind trees, and, seemingly getting closer. Then, I saw it. A few meters away, in the thick fog, a shape loomed. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal. It was tall, thin, with unnaturally long legs and slender arms that reached to the ground. Its face, nothing but a dark void. It didn't move. It slid closer to me. I froze. My heart stopped. Cold seeped through my bones. A sound echoed in my head, a hoarse, whispering voice, soft but haunting. "You're going too far." Suddenly, everything shattered. The fog swirled, the blackness wavered, and I heard a cacophony of sounds, footsteps, groans, gasps, all of it coming together in a chaotic storm. I turned and ran. I ran aimlessly, stumbling, clawing at branches, ignoring my aching legs. The whispers still followed me, like a cold wind in my ears. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. After an indefinite amount of time, I saw light, the light reflecting off my car. I rushed over, opened the door, and jumped in, slamming the door shut. My heart pounded as I hurriedly started the car. But just as I was about to drive away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Between the dark trees, a tall, thin shadow stood. It didn't chase. It just stood still, looking at me, though I couldn't see its eyes. And then, slowly, it raised an arm, as if to say goodbye. I didn't hesitate a second longer. I stepped on the gas, and sped away from the woods. I never went back that way. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear a soft whisper coming from the darkness. And I know, it's still there. I still remember the first night I entered the building. It was a simple night security job, just keeping track of who came in and out and making sure everything was safe. The previous guard tapped me on the shoulder and said, "This place is quiet. Just lock the door carefully and don't let anyone sneak in." At that time, I didn't think I would face anything other than the boredom of the night shift. But after a few days, I began to realize, something was wrong. It all started around midnight. I was watching the surveillance camera when I saw a flashing light in the hallway on the 5th floor. It was just a flash, not clear, but I felt a quiet unease creeping in. I decided to go check it out. The elevator was old and slow, so I took the stairs. The air got heavier the higher I went. There was a faint musty smell, as if the walls had been soaked with water for a long time. As I reached the 5th floor, the hallway stretched out before me, eerily silent. The offices were all closed. And then, footsteps. Heavy. Echoing behind me. I turned around. No one. I swallowed, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just my own echo. But then, the next night, the same thing happened. This time, I heard it more clearly. This time, the footsteps weren't mine. I walked to the end of the hallway, where there was a door leading to a storage room. It was locked. But I felt like something was standing right behind it. I tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. A chill ran down my spine. I went back to the security room, checked the cameras. And guess what? Nothing. The hallway was empty. Not a soul. No sign of movement. But I knew, I was sure, someone or something had been there. Over the next few nights, I heard more footsteps. Sometimes they echoed off the ceiling. Sometimes they were right behind me. Sometimes, I felt eyes watching me from the dark corners of the hallway. And then, one night, I decided to leave a recording microphone near the closet door. I wanted to know, if nothing was on the camera, if anything was recorded. The next morning, when I played the recording, my heart stopped. During the time I was gone, in the deep darkness of the 5th floor, I heard a whisper. The whisper was so long, so soft that I had to turn the volume all the way up to hear it. It said, "Go, go away." The very next day, I handed in my resignation. I never went back to that building. But I still wonder, if someone else had been on that shift, would they have heard those footsteps? Would they have heard that whisper? Do you believe in things like this? Or have you experienced something similar? If so, are you sure you're just imagining things? I never stayed long enough to catch it properly. It was like a quick flicker or a shadow that passed in front of the camera for a split second. But every time I played it back, the screen showed nothing. Sometimes I got the impression of a shape, but it was so fast that I thought maybe I was just tired. I tried adjusting the camera, thinking there might be a blind spot or a glitch, but nothing fixed it. I started to feel nervous about going upstairs. I still did because it was part of my job, but I dreaded those rounds of inspection. My heart started to beat faster as soon as I reached the 4th floor. The smell of dampness clung to me, and the hallway lights never flickered in a reassuring way. They always seemed to buzz or dim at the worst times. Sometimes I stood in the hallway for a few seconds, just to brace myself before entering. I had a constant feeling that someone was watching me from a dark corner or from behind one of the office doors. But every time I opened the door, there was only an empty room, a dusty desk, or an old chair, nothing else. The building manager came in one morning as I was getting ready to leave. He asked me how my night had gone. I told him everything was fine, a lie. I didn't want to sound like I was losing my mind. He nodded and said that a few people had mentioned hearing strange noises upstairs before, but they never found anything. Maybe it was just the pipes or the old ventilation system. I nodded, not pushing it, but part of me wanted to ask for more cameras or a more thorough inspection. I wanted proof that I wasn't imagining things. But I kept quiet, I needed this job. About 2 weeks into the job, I had the worst night since it all started. Everything went as usual. I locked the front door at 9 o'clock, checked the cameras, and went to check again at 11 o'clock. Nothing unusual. At around 2 a.m., I saw a flash of light again at the foot of the top floor. But this time, the flash lasted for a few seconds. The camera malfunctioned, showing static, then returned to normal. I saw something at the end of the hallway, near the last door on the right. It looked like a silhouette, just a dark outline. My stomach clenched. I left the security room, grabbed my flashlight, and walked up the stairs. My heart was pounding the whole way. When I reached the top, the hallway was darker than usual. The overhead lights were flashing. I walked slowly toward the last door. My footsteps echoed. And then, I heard another heavy footfall, like someone was 2 steps behind me. But when I turned around, there was no one. My hands were shaking. I felt sweat on my forehead. I asked softly, "Is anyone here?" Silence. The only sound was the hum of the old lamps. I shone the flashlight at the end of the hallway and scanned the wall. No movement. I reached the last door, put my hand on the knob, it was locked. I bent down and looked through the crack, it was pitch black. I stood there for a moment, listening. It felt like the building itself was holding its breath. Then I heard footsteps right behind me. Very close. I jumped. I spun around, the flashlight illuminating the empty space, no one there. A chill ran down my spine. I hurried down the stairs. When I got back to the security room, my legs were shaking. I sat down, trying to calm myself. Stared at the camera feed, the top floor was completely silent. Nothing unusual. I wondered if I was losing my mind. But I couldn't forget the sound of those footsteps, heavy, echoing. After that night, my routine changed. I still did the mandatory rounds, but I rushed. I hated the feeling of stagnant air there. Even the walls seemed different. Paint was peeling in places I hadn't noticed. The hallway lights were getting dimmer. I didn't know if it was fear or if something was really changing. My anxiety spilled over into my daily life. I couldn't sleep during the day, worried about going back to the night shift. But I still showed up, I needed the money. One night, I decided to try something different. I brought a small recorder with me, thinking maybe I could record the sound of those footsteps. I set it up in the hallway on the top floor around midnight, tucked it away in a corner where no one would see it. I pressed record and went back to the security room. At around 2 a.m., I saw another short flash of light on the camera feed. I noted the time. At the end of my shift, around 5 a.m., I picked up the recorder and took it home. When I played it back, I heard. I started hearing strange noises around 2 a.m. At first, it was just a faint buzzing of lights, but then I heard it more clearly, heavy footsteps. They echoed in the hallway, starting and stopping as if someone was pacing back and forth. There were no voices, no doors opening or closing, just an eerie silence after each movement. It gave me goosebumps. At least now I had proof that something was going on, but at the same time, it scared me even more. I thought about showing it to the manager, but decided against it. I didn't want to be seen as a troublemaker or a paranoid. So I kept quiet. Over the next few nights, the strange activity continued, heavy footsteps, unusual flashes on the cameras, the feeling of being watched that wouldn't go away. Sometimes, I caught a glimpse of a figure at the end of the hallway, but it disappeared before I could see it clearly. Every night was a mental torture, my heart pounding every time I had to climb the stairs. 2 weeks ago, I had an experience that still gives me goosebumps when I remember it. Around 1 a.m., I was watching the security screen when the camera on the top floor started flashing more than usual. Then it went black for a few seconds. I tried switching to another camera, but they were all off. Then the image came back, and I saw a figure standing motionless at the end of the hallway, right in front of the last door. It was too dark to make out a face or any features. It didn't move, just stood there facing the camera. My heart was pounding. I was about to run up to check, but at that moment, the figure disappeared, and the camera returned to normal. I grabbed my flashlight and ran upstairs with shaking hands. When I got there, the hallway was empty. The ceiling light was humming, and the door was locked as usual. I checked every corner, every closet, every room. Nothing. The air was heavy, damp, and foul. I felt nauseous and left as quickly as I could. Then I started asking the day shift cleaners. They didn't work nights, but they knew the building well. A man in his 50s told me that he always felt uneasy going up to the 5th floor, though he couldn't explain why. He didn't use flowery words, just that the place made him shiver. He never saw anyone, but sometimes he heard strange sounds when he worked late. This reassured me somewhat, at least I wasn't the only one who had experienced this feeling. But it also confirmed that what I had experienced wasn't just my imagination. I continued to do this job, listening to the sound of the empty hallways every night. I thought about quitting. My stomach clenched every time I climbed the stairs. The footsteps still echoed. The mysterious figure would occasionally appear on the camera, but when I played it back, nothing was recorded. There was no evidence except the feeling of being watched, the musty smell that never went away, and the strange flickering lights. Every time I unlocked the door to start my shift, I felt a tension in my chest. I did this because I needed the money, but part of me was always preparing for something worse. So far, no one had been hurt, and I had seen no sign of an intruder. But every time I reached the top floor, I knew I was not alone. I didn't tell anyone the whole story, because most would just laugh or tell me I was imagining things. But I knew the truth. I heard the heavy footsteps. I saw the strange lights on the monitor. I smelled the musty smell and felt the fear tightening in my chest. Night after night, I learned to live with it. And so far, that's all I can do. Then one night, when I moved into my new apartment, I woke up with a cold sweat running down my neck and my heart pounding. My bedroom door was ajar, though I clearly remembered closing it before I went to sleep. The hallway light was off, but a faint glow was coming from the bathroom. I walked over and noticed the bathroom door was wide open. I was sure I'd closed it. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to figure out what was going on. I checked the front door, still locked. No windows open. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. I am a 36-year-old man, recently divorced and trying to start a new life in a small ground-floor apartment in a quiet residential area. The apartment is in an old building with thick walls and narrow hallways. The landlord told me that the previous tenant had moved out because he wanted to live closer to work. I didn't think much of it. I liked that it was affordable and I had enough space. But after the first few nights, I realized that there was something wrong with the doors. Every night before going to bed, I made sure that all the doors in the apartment were closed. Sometimes, I even locked the bathroom door just to check that it was still in place. But the next morning, I often woke up to find some of the doors open, even though I clearly remembered closing them. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but when I checked the windows and door frames, I didn't find any gaps. The doors wouldn't move, no matter how hard I tried to create artificial air in the room. Yet each night they would mysteriously open. I began experimenting. I placed a small cardboard box in front of the bathroom door before going to bed. The next morning, the box was pushed aside about a foot, undamaged. Another time, I placed a paperback book on the door hinge, but the next morning, it appeared on the bathroom sink. My front door was still locked, with no signs of forced entry. This scared me. I decided to keep a small notebook by my bed. Whenever I heard strange noises at night, I noted the time. Most of the noises occurred between 2 and 4 a.m. Sometimes they were just tiny creaks, other times they sounded like the door latch was moving. The sleepless nights began to affect my work. I tried to tell a colleague, but she just nodded politely and suggested that it might be the structure of the building sinking, causing the door frame to move. I considered that, but the speed and repetition of the phenomenon did not make sense. I decided to take some security measures. I put small pieces of tape on the top edge of the door. If the door was opened, the tape would tear or fall off. But the next morning, all the tape was gone without a trace. I began to fear that someone was entering my apartment every night, moving around me while I slept. But the main door had a deadbolt and a chain lock, and the windows were solid. There was no sign of forced entry. My sleep became increasingly worse. I would wake up in a cold sweat around 2 or 3 in the morning, my heart pounding, my mouth dry. I would listen in the dark and sometimes hear soft noises from the other side of the apartment. I forced myself to check every room, living room, kitchen, bathroom, and each time, I found a door open when I was sure it had been closed. Sometimes the bathroom light would be on or the hallway closet door would be ajar. But I never saw anyone. I tried using a doorstop, a small wedge that holds a door in place. But every morning, I would find it pushed aside, and the door would still be open. I had no explanation for what was going on in this apartment. My apartment had no signs of a break-in, no signs of a break-in. But every morning I woke up feeling helpless. One night, around 2:15 a.m., I heard slow footsteps echoing in the hallway. My bedroom door was closed. I quickly reached for the nightstand, grabbed my cell phone, and sat up, listening nervously. My heartbeat was so loud it almost drowned out all other sounds. I considered calling the police, but didn't want to make a scene unless I was sure someone was home. Finally, I stood up. I crept toward the door, barely breathing. My legs were shaking, feeling weak. I opened the bedroom door, facing the dark hallway. I reached for the light switch, the bulb flickered and then came on. Nothing unusual. The apartment was eerily quiet. I checked the bathroom, pulled back the shower curtain, empty. I checked the front door, still locked, the chain bolt intact. I tried shaking the doorknob, nothing. Standing in the dark, my throat tightened with tension. The uneasiness didn't go away. I finally crawled back into bed, staring at the ceiling until the alarm clock went off at 6:30 a.m. I woke up, exhausted from lack of sleep. On the weekend, I decided to stay up late to observe. Around 1 a.m., I made coffee, set up a chair in the living room facing the hallway, leaving only a dim light on in the corner. I waited, phone in hand, trying not to fall asleep. At 2:40 a.m., my eyelids drooped. Suddenly, there was a soft sound, a scratching sound. I opened my eyes wide, sat up straight, my heart pounding. I looked toward the bathroom door. It was still closed, but the doorstop I'd placed earlier had been moved aside. I picked up my phone, turned on the camera, and pointed back down the hallway. Cautiously, I stepped forward, realizing the bathroom door latch was still locked. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. There was no other sound. After a few seconds, I slid the latch, turned the knob, and pushed the door open. The door opened with a small click. I slid my phone in first, filming the small room. The lights were still off. I turned on my phone's flashlight, illuminating the area, nothing unusual. The small window was still locked. I swallowed, my breathing quickened, my palms sweaty. I stepped outside, almost tripping over the doorstop lying on the floor. There were no scratches or signs of tampering, as if it had simply been moved without anyone touching it. The next morning, I went to the store and bought a cheap motion sensor camera. I placed it in the hallway, facing the bathroom and bedroom doors. I tested it, it worked fine. That night, I left it recording overnight. When I woke up the next morning, the camera was off. The battery was still alive, but the switch was turned off. I checked the footage. The last recording was at 2:13 a.m., and then there was static. The last frame showed an empty hallway, the bathroom door still closed. I stared at the image, searching for a clue. There was no one, no sign of what had happened. But I knew something was wrong. I no longer felt safe in my own apartment. I lay in bed, tensely waiting for the slightest sound in the night. Another time, I tried opening all the doors at night to see if anything had changed. I had dinner, watched some TV, and fell asleep on the sofa. When I woke up in the middle of the night, everything was still quiet. But I had the feeling that someone was standing in the doorway, staring at me in the dark. And when I turned on the light, the door was still closed as if nothing had happened. The mysterious apartment. I have never believed in ghosts. Hauntings are a figment of my imagination, at least I used to think so. But there are things that happen that I can't explain, and I'm afraid that if I tell them, people will think I'm crazy. It all started a few months ago, when I moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap, the location was convenient, and the landlord wasn't too demanding. I had no reason to refuse. When I first moved in, everything seemed normal. I rearranged my furniture, cleaned up, and enjoyed my new space. But after only a week, strange things started happening. The closet door in the hallway. It never stayed where I left it. Every night before I went to bed, I made sure I closed it, but the next morning it was open, sometimes a little wider. I told myself that maybe I had forgotten to close it completely. But then things got weirder. One night, while I was watching TV in the living room, the light suddenly went out. I jumped, my heart pounding. The phone was still on, no sign of a power outage. I tried turning the light back on, and it came back on immediately. But when I turned to the hallway, the closet door was wide open. This time, I was sure I had closed it. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that maybe the hinges were loose. I taped the door shut. But the next night, I woke up in the middle of the night to a small sound, a very soft rattling. When I opened my eyes, I saw the streetlights coming through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. The closet door was half open. The tape I had put on yesterday was gone. A chill ran down my spine. There was no one else in the apartment but me. The front door lock was intact. There was no sign of an intruder. But somehow, the door still opened every night. I decided to install a small camera facing the hallway to see what was happening while I slept. I checked the switches, replaced the batteries, made sure everything was working properly. Then I went to bed, trying to ignore my fear. The next morning, the memory card was gone. The camera was still there, but there was no data on it. I searched the apartment, the floor, under the furniture, but there was no trace. I felt sick. Did someone take it? Or did something not want me to know the truth? I couldn't sleep for the next few days. I locked my bedroom door, left the light on all night, but the closet door was still open in the morning. There was a creaking sound in the middle of the night, even though I hadn't heard anything while I was sleeping. I decided to leave the apartment. I told my landlord that I would be moving out at the end of the month. I didn't care about the deposit anymore, I just wanted to get away from this place. The last night, I tried something else. I put a chair in front of the closet door. I wanted to see if it would move. 3 in the morning. A loud bang woke me up. I turned on the light immediately. The chair was pushed aside. The closet door was wide open. And right in front of it, on the floor, there was a black handprint, as if someone, or something, had touched it with dirty hands. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw my things into a suitcase, not bothering to pack carefully. I left that night. I rented a hotel room, and the next morning, I officially left the apartment for good. From that day on, I didn't hear any more creaking, didn't wake up in the middle of the night feeling like I was being watched. I stayed at a friend's house, and slept soundly for the first time in weeks. I don't want to think about that apartment anymore. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when I close my eyes, I still hear the sound of the closet door opening in the darkness. And I wonder, if I go back there, will I still find my camera? Or will I find something else waiting for me? Mysterious passenger. It was almost midnight, colder than usual. The streetlights were scattered, creating deep shadows. I was a taxi driver, doing this job for many years, but tonight there was something strange. There was an eerie feeling in my heart as I accepted a ride from the outskirts of the city. I drove to the pickup point. A man stood by the side of the road, the dim light barely illuminating his face. He was wearing a dark coat, his figure thin. When I stopped the car, he got in and sat in the back seat. He didn't say a word. "Where are you going?" I asked, looking in the rearview mirror. He was silent for a moment, then gave an unfamiliar address. His voice was low and hoarse, a little tired. I nodded and started driving. After a while, I realized the passenger was whispering something. It sounded like a strange language, unlike any I had ever heard. I ignored it at first, but it became more and more obvious, not loud, but insistent, like a mysterious chant. I tilted my head, trying to hear what he was saying. "Excuse me, what are you saying?" The passenger stopped immediately. I glanced at the rearview mirror, catching his eye. A slight jolt ran down my spine. There was no answer, just a stare that made me tighten my grip on the steering wheel. A strange feeling began to take over, as if I had lost control of my surroundings. About 10 minutes later, my phone crashed. The GPS was distorted, then completely dead. I touched the screen, but it didn't respond. This had never happened before, especially on this route. "The signal's gone," I muttered, not sure if I was talking to him or to myself. There was no response from the back seat. I tried the radio, but it was just a blank screen. No music, no noise. Just an eerie silence. I was starting to get really nervous now. "Turn here," the passenger said suddenly, speaking clearly for the first time. I looked toward the road on the right. It was darker and more deserted than usual, not like a main road. I hesitated but turned in anyway. The streetlights were sparse, casting strange shadows on the road. The houses on either side had their shutters closed, as if the whole neighborhood had long been abandoned. We passed intersections, and each time I tried to turn onto a brighter road, he fell silent, until I reached an empty area. The buildings were crumbling, the air heavy and oppressive. "Stop here," he said. Not a request, but an order. I slowed down, feeling a shiver run down my spine. I looked in the mirror. The passenger leaned forward, his face revealed in the dim light. He smiled, but there was no friendliness in it. It was a weak, eerie smile, and his eyes were so lifeless that they sent a chill down my spine. I felt the need to unbuckle my seatbelt, just in case I needed to move quickly. Then he chuckled, a laugh that was not amused. He opened the door, stepped out. But the way he moved was not normal. Not walking, but gliding. In a flash, he disappeared into the darkness. I stuck my head out the window, trying to follow him. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no figure. There was only a deserted street and a heavy atmosphere pressing down on my chest. My instincts told me not to stay any longer. I started the engine, stepped on the gas, and drove away. No looking back. No stopping. Just getting out of this area as quickly as possible. When I got back to a more crowded area, my phone suddenly started working again. The GPS started up, the radio played normally. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew it had. I never took another ride from that area again. And I'll never forget the look in his eyes in the rearview mirror. Strange noises in my house last night. Everything changed around 11. I was in my bedroom brushing my teeth and going about my usual routine. Where I live is an old 2-story house with creaky floors and doors that don't always close properly. I've lived here alone for the past 3 years. I rent cheap because most people don't want an old house with drafty windows and unpredictable plumbing. I never mind those little inconveniences, they feel manageable, but what happened last night was unmanageable. All I had changed into a T-shirt and sweatpants. I was reaching for the light switch when I heard distinct footsteps in the hallway. At first I froze. I told myself it was probably falling wood or a small animal outside, but these footsteps had a weight to them. They sounded slow. Deliberate footsteps on the hallway floor. I looked at the door and felt my heart beat fast. I live alone and uninvited. No one else should be walking around. My first thought was that maybe someone had broken in. I stood there listening, not moving for a solid 5 seconds. My mouth went dry. I swallowed and grabbed the closest thing I could use as a makeshift weapon, which was a heavy flashlight next to the nightstand. I turned off the bedroom light, thinking that if anyone was there they probably wouldn't notice me right away. I moved closer to the door, pressed my ear to the door. The hallway was dark, so I couldn't see anything through the crack under the door. The footsteps stopped for a moment. I waited, every muscle tensed, hoping they would continue. Instead, I heard something else, a soft dragging sound like fabric on the floor. Then the footsteps started again, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I gathered up the courage to open the door. A shout. I wanted to look into the hallway. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. As soon as I touched the doorknob, I heard a muffled voice, so faint at first I thought I might be imagining things, but then it got clearer. It sounded like someone was whispering in a language I couldn't recognize. The voice was deep and hoarse, and the words made no sense except for one word. My name was certain. Hearing my name in between those strange syllables, I pulled my hand away from the doorknob. Startled, my stomach went cold, my breathing quickened, and I realized my hand was shaking. I wanted to call the police, but I also didn't want to let go of the flashlight or make any noise. I stood there uncertain. While the voice kept whispering, the sound rose and fell almost like a chant, but it didn't feel religious or comforting. It felt invasive and private. Hearing my name mixed with that foreign language made my skin crawl. I decided to try the doorknob again. My plan was simple. I turned it. The door opened quickly, shining the flashlight and facing whoever was out there. Could just be an intruder teasing me, but as soon as I tried to turn the knob, the whispering got louder. It turned into an urgent mumble so fast I couldn't hear anything apart from that voice repeating my name like a voice warning me not to open the door. I tried to turn it all the way, but it didn't work. It was strange because I had never locked my bedroom door from the inside and no one else could lock it from the outside. I shook it harder, but it was stuck in place. I pressed my shoulder against the door. It felt like it was closing, like the door frame had been opened wide. Then I felt a strong push from the other side, almost like someone was leaning against it. Rose's whisper was so loud and I could tell it was someone or something on the other side just inches away. I felt a surge of adrenaline and tried to push the door again. I slammed my shoulder against the wood, my heart pounding in my chest and my palms were sweaty, but the door didn't budge. The voice was now just a hoarse hiss, filling my ears with strange sounds. My name was getting louder every few seconds, surrounded by that hoarse voice. I panicked, scared. I started screaming for whoever was there to leave me alone. I yelled that I was calling the police. My voice was shaking and I didn't think it sounded scary at all. I took my pH from the nightstand. The signal in my house is usually fine, but I noticed the bars were at 0. I tried calling anyway to no avail. My throat felt tight and I was gasping for air. I stepped back from the door, still shining the flashlight in there. Even though the door was closed so the light was only hitting the painted wood, the whisper became a steady buzzing, almost overwhelming. I wasn't sure what to do next. My window faced the backyard, which was fenced in. Jumping out wouldn't be safe, plus it was a second-story window. My mind was racing with images of what could be outside my bedroom door, an intruder, a stranger, unbalanced, but that voice didn't sound normal. Long nights I love the quiet after dusk, when the roads and trails are empty and the sky turns pitch black. There is a kind of quietness that comes with darkness, and I always feel comfortable being out there alone with my tripod and camera. The quietness started to fade about 3 months ago. It started when I noticed strange shapes in my photos, dark smudges that vaguely looked like people. At first I thought it was a problem with the camera sensor or something stuck to the lens, but that explanation never worked. I cleaned everything thoroughly. I changed cameras, I used different lenses. Those shapes were still there, and they only appeared when I was alone in remote places. I remember the first time I realized something was really wrong. I was standing on a ridge overlooking the little valley. The sky was clear, so I took a long exposure to capture the stars and a bit of the trees. I was alone, away from the town, nearest town, for hours, light breeze, and the only sounds coming from insects and rustling leaves in the distance. Everything was normal, so I didn't feel any immediate fear. After taking a series of photos, I checked the screen. Then I saw a shape that looked like a silhouette standing right at the edge of the frame near a row of trees that didn't look like a person walking by. It looked as still as a shadow freeze in where I felt my chest tighten, and I glanced up from the camera to see if anyone was there. I stood still, scanning the area with my flashlight, but I didn't see anything unusual. I considered it a glitch. I thought maybe my camera had captured a shadow from a branch or a strange artifact from a long exposure. But a week later I was out again. This time I was shooting an old abandoned barn right next to a dirt road in the middle of nowhere with no lights for miles. I set up camp around midnight. The barn looked creepy in the dark, and I aimed to capture the texture of the wooden planks in the moonlight. I shot a few shots at different angles, adjusting the tripod height and shutter speed. Then, while reviewing a test shot, I saw a dark outline near the side of the cage that looked like a person standing with their back to me. My heart was pounding, and I lowered the camera. I looked around in all directions, shining the flashlight on the cage walls, the grass, even the fence. Nothing. When I looked back at the camera screen, the shape was in the photo. It was tall and slightly distorted. It looked almost like it turned its head towards me, but there was no facial expression. I could tell it was just a distorted shadow. I thought about leaving immediately, but I decided to take a few more shots to see if it would appear again. My hands were shaking and my breathing was weak. I remember the feeling in my stomach, a heavy lump that wouldn't go away. Every time I took a new photo, I checked right away. Sometimes the shape was there, sometimes it wasn't, but I never saw it with my naked eye. I just looked through the camera. I finally packed up and drove away, trying not to speed on the dark road, back to town, home. I opened the files on my computer. I zoomed in on those silhouettes in a few images. The shape looked like it had a face, but was warped, like it was smeared on the photo. It had eyes like the hollows, and a hint of a mouth, but they were in the wrong place, as if someone had dragged them across the image with a cursor. I checked the metadata. There was nothing wrong with the files. They just had these shadows in them, inexplicable. My hands became clammy and I felt sick looking at them. I tried to think rationally. Maybe there was some noise with my sensor or a weird reflection, but deep down inside, I knew it felt different than a mechanical glitch. I tried to ignore it for a while. I took daytime photos and edited my backlog of photos from the past few months. Months without something strange appeared in any of the daytime photos, only the night photos and only in remote places. After a while I decided to try again, but closer to civilization. I went to a location near the city, a small park with street lights nearby. I took a few photos. The night sky and everything looked fine, no silhouettes, no shadows. It seemed like whatever was going on only appeared when I was in more isolated areas. I convinced myself it might have something to do with some specific external interference to those locations. Then I went to the coast for a weekend trip. I camped near a rocky beach known for its beautiful night skies. There was almost no light pollution and the waves crashed against the rocks in a steady rhythm, which usually helped me relax. On the second night I set up my tripod on the shore. I could hear the ocean. I tasted the salt. The lawyer shoved them into my hands without much detail. He just gave me the address and said I could do whatever I wanted with the place. His tone seemed rushed and he avoided eye contact. I remember the tight feeling in my chest when I first saw the photo of the mansion. It looked old and dark even in the daylight. I felt nervous about going so far, but I couldn't ignore such a legacy. Now I was standing in the spacious front yard, staring at the sunken tiles and a dusty porch, the boards under my feet, the creak. With each step, the wind was still. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. The front door felt rough as I ran my palm over it. The wood smelled like old varnish and mold. I pushed it open and it scraped against the frame. There was something in the entryway that felt cold-like. Inside a cave, I walked in and the door slammed shut behind me. I could see a hallway stretching to the left and a curved staircase to the second floor on the right. The air was stuffy and I sensed a slight smell of damp. I glanced at the peeling wallpaper walls in street. The pattern strips were probably decades old. Some faded floral dust flew in the narrow beam of light coming from the open door. I noticed a few pieces of furniture, a small table near the stairs, a large coat rack by the wall and an armchair with torn upholstery. In the corner the whole place felt cramped despite the large foyer. Maybe it was the low lighting or the thick shadows in every corner. I heard my stomach growling. I hadn't eaten all day. I closed the front door and locked it and walked into the hallway trying to find the kitchen. My footsteps echoed. Each step made a dull sound on the old floor. I came to a door at the end of the hallway which was unlocked. I opened it and found the kitchen. It had a long counter, a large rust-stained sink and a wooden table. In the middle there is an old refrigerator on one side. But there is no electricity in the house at the moment. I lean back against the table and open the door. Inside I have a few sandwiches and a bottle of water. I sit down and eat in silence. The taste of dry bread and warm ham doesn't matter. I am hungry. Halfway through my sandwich I notice a small noise coming from the hallway like a whisper, but I can't make out a word. I stop chewing and hold my breath. The noise disappears. I feel a chill on the back of my neck. I clear my throat, eat the sandwich and drink some water. I decide to explore. First floor. I go back down the hallway and walk carefully, looking into each room. The living room has a few cupboards, a sofa covered with sheets and an old TV on a stand, dirty windows and little light coming into the dining room, empty except for a long wooden chair. The table and chairs are pushed aside. The air is colder there, so I don't linger. I go back to the foyer and stand at the bottom of the stairs. I look up the stairs leading to the second floor hallway which I can see from below. It was dark. I walked up the first staircase and it creaked every step I took, making a slow moaning sound. Above I saw a long hallway with a series of doors on each side, some closed, some half open. I smelled mold and I felt a slight breeze. I walked into the first room on the right. It was a small bedroom with a single bed, wardrobe and a window overlooking the front yard. The curtains were thick and dusty. I opened them a little to let some light in. There was a thick layer of dust on the wardrobe. I wiped my finger on it, leaving a trail on the dark surface. I heard something in the hallway, like a gentle shuffling, and turning around I saw nothing. I waited a few seconds. My heart beat a little harder. I walked back into the hallway, but it was empty. The house was silent again. I continued checking each bedroom. Most of them were old furniture, old air wallpaper peeling. Then I came to the last door at the end of the hallway. It was stuck. I pushed my shoulder against it a few times until it finally opened with a loud crack. Inside I saw a larger bedroom with a large window with a bed, a wardrobe and a mirror on the wall. The bed frame was metal and looked rusty. The wardrobe door was slightly ajar, but I couldn't see inside from where I was standing. The full-length mirror mounted on a wooden board was covered in a thin layer of dirt. I caught my own reflection. My face looked tired and there was an anxious twitch on my left side. The smell in this room was worse, a mixture of damp wood and something sour. I opened the window, but the hinges were stiff and it creaked when I finished exploring. The daylight outside had faded. My phone battery was almost dead. I had a small flashlight in my backpack, so I took it out. The light was weak but enough to light my way down the stairs. I decided to spend the night in the living room on the first floor as it was less musty there. Head back in, locked the doors and tried my phone again. Suddenly I had full bars. The GPS map loaded right away. Notifications popped up one after another like nothing had been wrong. Even my radio turned back on by itself, blaring the last station I had tuned to. I jumped at the sudden noise, then fumbled to shut it off. I felt a wave of relief, but also confusion. 1 second everything was dead, the next second it was all fine. I shook my head, put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. My stomach felt queasy. I glanced back at the dark street, but I didn't see anything except a stretch of road disappearing under broken lights. My phone buzzed, alerting me to new ride requests, but I ignored them for a moment. I just wanted to get somewhere bright and safe. I found the main road again, and as soon as I hit the busier avenue the world felt normal. Cars drove by. Street lights worked. The phone never lost signal. I took a deep breath, parked at a gas station and got out to stretch my legs. My knees felt weak and my hands trembled. I checked the back seat. The passenger hadn't left anything behind. The seat wasn't even warm like he'd never been there. I shook my head in disbelief. What the hell was that? I whispered to myself. A part of me wondered if I should call the cops, but I didn't have a crime to report. He didn't threaten me, didn't do anything illegal as far as I knew. I decided to let it go. Standing by the gas pump I felt the cool night air on my face. It helped me calm down a bit. I took a few more deep breaths, trying to shake off the tense feeling in my chest. My phone stayed connected, which made me feel a little better. I stared at it, half expecting it to glitch again, but it seemed stable. I got back in the car and looked at the clock. The entire trip had taken about 25 minutes, though it felt a lot longer. My shift wasn't over, but I considered calling it a night. I had a sick feeling in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I started driving toward my usual spots where bars stay open late. Maybe I could pick up a normal fare, something to push this weird experience out of my mind. But as I cruised, every time I glanced at the rearview mirror I half expected to see that man's eyes staring back. I picked up 2 more passengers that night, both pretty regular, a guy headed home from work and a woman needing a ride to a nightclub. Nothing strange happened with them. My phone and radio worked fine. By the time my shift ended the sun was starting to rise and I felt exhausted. I went home, parked in my usual spot and just sat in my car for a minute. I replayed everything in my head, his side ins, the muttering, the dead signals, his sudden departure, how the phone came back online right after. It made no sense. I asked myself if I had missed something. Maybe the passenger was having a medical episode or was under the influence, but that wouldn't explain the electronics dying the way they did. Then coming back, I didn't see him carry any device that could jam signals. It didn't look like he was messing with anything on his phone. He never used his phone in the car at all, and he left so fast. I didn't have any friends who would believe me without a bit of joking around, so I never told the full story. I just said I had a weird ride that night, but every time I recall it I feel that pressure in my chest, that cold sweat. The memory of him smiling in that unsettling way. It wasn't a big grin, it was just a small curve of the lips, but it felt threatening in a way I can't fully explain. I've been driving for years and I've seen rude passengers, angry ones, even a few who were obviously intoxicated. None of them freaked me out like that. After a few nights I returned to the same area to see if there was something off about the place. I drove by the street. During the day it looked like any neglected neighborhood with a few vacant lots and old buildings. The street. EXT, dark street, night. An old car is parked on the side of the road. A light drizzle falls on the windshield, glistening under the flickering street lights. Inside the CR, the driver, 30, tired looking, wearing a light jacket, is checking his phone. The screen reads, "Lost connection." He sighs, taps the screen but gets no response. Suddenly, all the car's systems turn back on at once. The headlights are bright, the phone shows a full signal, the GPS loads instantly. The radio turns on automatically, broadcasting the last station he was listening to. The driver, startled, turns off the radio with a shaking hand. He looks around. The street is quiet, not a soul in sight. Only the flickering street lights, long shadows on the wet pavement. Hesitating for a moment, he shook his head, put the car in gear, and drove away. But a strange feeling followed him, an invisible anxiety, as if someone were still sitting behind the driver's seat. EXT, gas station, night. The driver pulled over, got out of the car. He took a deep breath, the cool night air making him feel better. His hands were still shaking as he pulled out his phone to check. Everything seemed normal. But the question still echoed in his head. Driver, whispering. What the hell just happened? He opened the car door, checked the back seat. Nothing. No trace. But something was wrong. The seat was cold. As if no one had ever sat there. He bit his lip, debating whether to call the police. Then he smiled faintly to himself, no crime, no threat, nothing to report. He turned back to the car, looked at his watch. The trip had only been 25 minutes, but it felt like hours. His shift wasn't over yet, but the thought of driving again made him nauseous. Driver, mumbling. Just tired, right? He shook his head, started the car, and drove off. But as his eyes scanned the rearview mirror, an invisible fear rose. Every time he glanced, he expected to see a shadow in the back passion, eyes wide open, staring straight at him. Lamps were there, some broken, some missing. I couldn't find anything unusual, no big electrical towers or weird transmissions that might explain my phone's behavior. I parked for a minute and stared at the spot where I pulled over that night. It looked completely ordinary in daylight. I felt a chill. Though I remembered that empty feeling, the silence, the flickering light, I started feeling uneasy again, so I left. I continued driving nights, but I never got another request from that spot. I watched my phone a bit closer, making sure the GPS was stable, everything worked. Normally the memory never left, though every time I pick up someone who sits quietly or stares too long my pulse quickens. I remember that passenger's face in my mirror. I remember the tension in my gut when the roads are empty and the radio is low. I almost expect it all to happen again. I have a routine now. I keep my car in good condition, check the electrical systems, make sure my phone has the latest updates. I also watch my passengers more carefully. If someone gets in and acts too strange, I might ask them a few questions right away. I try to keep my distance if they make me uneasy. Still, nothing has been as unsettling as that one ride. I'll never know what caused the signal to vanish or why everything returned to normal the second he left. I sometimes think about the possibility of him waiting out there looking for another ride. Maybe he does that to drivers, messing with their heads. I don't know. All I know is that I felt real fear that night, the kind that makes your heart pee and your skin crawl. I didn't see any weapons, no direct threat, but it was enough to leave me shaky and confused. Some nights I push the memory aside and do my job without any issues. Other nights, like tonight, I can't help but remember when I see a lone figure standing in a dark spot. My thoughts jump back to him. I wonder if I should accept the request or just drive on. Usually I accept, but part of me is always ready for something strange to happen again. The city can be unpredictable late at night, and I've seen more than my share of odd characters, but that passenger was different. I still can't explain why, and I guess I never will. So that's what happened. No children were involved, no one died, but it shook me. I still drive, but I keep my senses on high alert. Late nights on the road can get eerie, and I've learned to trust my gut. I can't forget the way he stared at me in the mirror, or the way the radio and phone died then came back the second he stepped out. It felt like I was stuck in a bad dream until he vanished into the shadows, and once he did, it was like none of it had ever happened. That's the story I can't get out of my head. Even telling it now I feel a little on edge, like someone's behind me watching, but there's no one here. It's just me recalling that weird night. I have no explanation for it, I have no evidence. All I know is how it felt. I guess that's all I can really say. It happened, and it hasn't happened since. But sometimes on a lonely street at 2 in the morning I wonder if it could happen again, and if it does, I'm not sure what I'll do. I'll probably just keep driving and hope I make it through the night. I didn't think anything could shake me out there. I've camped in that mountainous region more times than I can count, and it's always felt like my territory. Then I went on a Tuesday, expecting my usual peace, and by Thursday night I realized I'd misjudged everything. I got to the trailhead around noon on Tuesday. The parking lot was empty. There were no other cars and not even a single person hanging around. I felt a little thrilled at the idea of having the place to myself. I like that solitude. It's a break from the constant noise of my job in the city. I loaded up my pack with a tent, my cooking gear, some food, and a few changes of clothes. The air felt crisp and the sky was clear. I started the hike. The path was a little rough in places, but I'd been there Enough times to know every stretch. I noticed how quiet it was. I couldn't hear voices or music or anything that usually comes with other campers, just my footsteps and the distant sounds of birds. My breathing became steady as I moved uphill, and I felt that usual rush of calm I get when I leave civilization behind. My plan was to reach a clearing about 3 miles in where there's a small plateau with flat ground for the tent. I got there by mid-afternoon. The place looked just like I remembered, some tall pines, a view of a nearby ridge, and a small circle of stones where people sometimes build their campfires. I set down my pack, stretched my shoulders, and started pitching my tent. No complicated steps. I spread out the ground sheet, slid the poles into place, and staked everything down. I pulled out a small folding chair from my pack, set it next to where I planned to make a fire, and just sat there for a few minutes, letting my muscles